discussion around it is a lovely opportunity, to not just understand a particular art from Bengal, but any art in general. And today and tomorrow we'll see the concluding parts of those pre-designed sessions that they are conducting. And we have reserved two more sessions, which is next week. And we only need to be more thankful to them for taking this time out for us, where they will actually be able to work with a specific group of people, a specific group of teachers, to kind of try and discuss how some of this material can then be taken to the classroom, or sort of how do you then start working with such material. And if I'm wrong, Shujan and Sumana, please correct me, but there might even be an opportunity where you might want to bring up something that you are familiar with and that you might want to work with, because those basic principles and ideas remain the same. They are speaking about a particular set of artworks, a particular period of art in India and in Bengal, but that does not restrict us to discuss methodologies. We are trying to move towards that. That how do we make some of these ideas accessible and interesting and understandable, for the young audiences that we work with, right? So unfortunately, like I mentioned before, I am sort of stuck in also conducting a set of classes for some students from where I took a little break. So I'll request you all to get started. I will try to join in around 6:15 when the class gets over, because I imagine you all will probably go on till about 6:30. Yes?
Yeah. Latest,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
I think
as
it will be done.
yeah, yeah. So by 6:10, I'll try to
Sure,
wrap
sure.
up and come back into the session. But please carry on. Have a great time. In fact, today is nice because there is a small group of people. So I would imagine that the interaction would be much more intimate and interactive. So have a great time. I'll see you guys in an hour. And in case you guys are wrapping up before I turn up, please mention this again and try to let people sort of. So if more people want to join in tomorrow and then start thinking about what to do next week, let's also discuss that towards the end of the session. That how can we use the 2 days that we have with Sujan and Shumana next week more meaningfully and fruitfully for ourselves. Okay. Thank you so much. Please continue. Yeah. And I'll come back to you guys.
Thank you, Abhish.
Bye. Bye.
Okay. So, Shumana, would you like to introduce the two sessions, or should we jump in? And
Yeah, I can do a brief introduction.
yeah,
Okay,
cool.
so hello everyone. I'm Shimona, and with me is my colleague Shujan. And for those of you who haven't attended the previous sessions, we represent DAG, formerly Delhi Art Gallery, and we represent as museums initiatives because since 2019, DAG has been partnering with the government to set up museums in different parts of the country. The first one was at the Red Fort in Delhi. It's called Drishyakala, and the second one is in Kolkata, where both of us are based, and it's called Ghare Baire. And both these museum exhibitions really take sort of advantage of DAG's really vast collection of pre-modern and modern Indian art. Ghare Baire specifically focuses on Bengal. And during the lockdown, we tried different methodologies, and during the lockdown and after, we tried different methodologies for engaging with the art and using art as a way to engage with the past in a more critical and engaged way for young people. So Sujana, we started this program called Time Traveling Through Art from Plassey to Partition, where we took a select set of artworks and tried to, revisit familiar moments in our subcontinent's history, but through the artworks, hoping that we arrive at new perspectives about those very familiar histories. So in the last two sessions, we introduced a viewing room that we had created, and that was one methodology for engaging students on Zoom through virtual walks of this viewing room. In the sessions with Seagull, there were about 90 people, but with students, we used to do smaller groups, so they were very interactive, and we would really start with the artwork and interpreting the artwork before then going into the history. With the group here with Seagull, it was more of a sort of crash course in Bengal art, and more of sort of presenting the artworks and the possibilities and questions that perhaps could open up ideas for how we can use these artworks in classrooms. So we were not so much demonstrating the session that we did with students, but presenting it to you as a kind of catalog, or as a kind of buffet of artworks and stories that you could maybe tap into for your own classrooms. Now today, Shujan is really going to talk us through one such way in which we use this artwork. And we used it to create some WhatsApp learning modules. You know, in a way, it was an attempt to counter this WhatsApp university, or at least not to find a small space within it. And that's also how, we thought we could reach out to students who don't have access to computers and to good internet and won't be able to attend our Zoom sessions. So it was really interesting coming up with these. It was really fun, interesting, and challenging coming up with these short WhatsApp videos where we were trying to have the same kind of conversations that we're having in the virtual room, but with a group of students in a WhatsApp learning group. So it was quite an experiment for all of us, and it was shot and created at home. So it was very DIY as well, but I think it opened up lots of new possibilities again. So we wanted to share these tools with you. You could use them directly, or we could use it to come up with, use the methodology and apply it to our own contexts and to materials and objects from museums, where you are in your location as well. So without saying much more, I'd like to hand over to Shujan, who will now show you some of these modules and then of course use it as a springboard for new ideas and discussions. So thanks so much, Shujan, and over to you.
Thanks, Shivana. Yeah, so like Shivana was saying, so we were designing this WhatsApp, this module called Time Traveling Through Art, which some of you went through with us over the last couple of sessions. And while we were doing this, like Shivana said, this was partly to kind of counter that sort of WhatsApp University sort of space, but also from our end, we were thinking in terms of digital accessibility as well. So questions of, how many people are, I mean, we know for a fact that not too many people are able to access that kind of bandwidth or the kind of technology that you need to participate in a Zoom session. So the one thing that we were trying with this WhatsApp module was to make sure that people who had access to a phone, I mean, that's pretty much the baseline that we could sort of operate with. Um, Beyond that, there really wasn't any way during the pandemic, at least, to make sure that our reach was wider. We would have ideally liked that, and if the museum were open, then we have been, even before that, we have been kind of building a network of lower income schools, NGOs who are working with children. So this was partly driven by that, and as we go along, I'll also try and um, explain why we did certain things in certain specific ways, because which all sort of came together partly as we were doing it, so it wasn't something that we had completely figured out when we launched into it. And like Shumona said, these were all sort of DIY, very kind of um, I mean, quickly put together. I mean, we thought through it, but we put it together with very minimal logistical sort of backing. So just because we weren't sure how much we would be able to scale it up, if we knew that this is something that would be definitely scaled up and that would reach out to a lot of people, we certainly would have liked to produce the videos better. And that's something that's not off the table even now. So that's something that we are looking to do. So without further ado, I'll just go to this PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared just to kind of put everything together so that it's easier for us to talk about them and present them. And yeah, in the meantime, if you have questions or comments, observations, please feel free to share them with us. I'll now just go over to my presentation. Yeah. So let's see. From the beginning. Yeah. So this essentially, so what we'll do is, um, this is a 6-part, the entire WhatsApp module of Time Traveling Through Art has 6 chapters, which kind of each draw upon one artwork each. So there are 6 artworks, which we'll show you in the next slide, that kind of, become sort of nodal, points around which we have discussions about critical moments in the history of modern India. So the time frame that we are looking at is roughly the same, which is it starts after the Battle of Plassey. So we start with the Black Hole Monument or the Holwell Monument, and we come down to post-independence India to the works of Robin Mondal. So each chapter has a specific learning objective, which is to say we try to communicate one thing through a chapter. And also, as we were discussing this with others who have been working in the field, we realized that it also needed to have a kind of graded sort of learning objective. So to start with, the idea is to try to make people see the details, notice the details, and look a little closer at the paintings. Then gradually we try out different things. So I hope that will be interesting for you as well as we go along. So each chapter has basically three parts. The first is an art challenge, where we introduce one work of art. We talk about one specific aspect of it, and then we ask students to come up with responses. The second part is the challenge poster, which is basically a summing up of that of what we have said in the art challenge video in the form of one still image that students are able to access. And the third part, after we have received the responses from students on WhatsApp, so they basically take pictures on their phones of whatever they have drawn or sketched or painted, and they send it back to us. So the final part basically is where we explain a little more and try to talk about what else the painting can tell us about that time. So these are the six um, artworks that we selected from. Those of you who were there for the previous sessions, you might be able to recognize it from the viewing room. The first one, like I said, was from the late the painting is from the early 1800s, but we are talking of an event that shapes the history of modern Bengal and modern India, which is the capture of Calcutta by Sirajuddaulah and the subsequent Battle of Plassey, which sees a kind of consolidation of British rule in Bengal and in India. The second one, it's an interesting, the second one, which is on the bottom left, which is it's an untitled work. It's from the early Bengal group of paintings, which is to say that these are artists who are kind of some Indian, some European artists who were exchanging notes about their different traditions. Both visual and narrative traditions, and coming up with these beautiful sort of remixed artworks almost. So in this one, where we see this kind of landscape, and on top of that it's almost a copy paste on Photoshop, where you have this sudden appearance of this figure of Radha, but she's wearing this crown, which we'll get into that in a bit. But the basic point of this was to talk about this kind of cultural exchanges, and also to talk about Mughal symbols of power, and this kind of emergence of this new form of art. The third one, which is bottom center, was Omanindranath Tagore's The Passing of Shah Jahan. So on the one hand, it talks about the Swadeshi moment, where Omanindranath is looking to find a different sort of pan-Asian identity of Indian art. But also it's a very interesting moment in terms of the visual history, because he's looking back to Mughal miniatures, and he's trying to do something new with them by mixing these different sort of traditions that he is assimilating, the Japanese, the wash technique that he adopts from the Japanese, and so on and forth. Um, the fourth one, again, a slightly more mature phase of the Indian nationalist movement, Nandalal Bosu's poster painted in 1937 for the Haripura Congress. So this is the poster you might remember, which he was, Mahatma Gandhi requested Nandalal to paint a number of posters that would kind of uphold these ideas of rural India and the rhythms of rural India and so on. And that was why he painted this entire series of posters. The fourth one, which is top center, is a sketch by Chitta Prasad from the 1942-43 famine. So the idea behind this was to encourage students to think, and this was also, during the time, during the lockdown, we were seeing these kinds of, the migrant laborers who are, I mean, on this kind of interminable walk home, which many of them didn't actually go through, couldn't finish. So we wanted students to kind of, think about the responsibilities that artists have at moments like this, the ethics of visual journalism as well. Although that's not easy to translate for a very young audience, but these are questions that did come up in a sense, because the responses that we got were actually quite remarkable from a group of students who were actually painting scenes that they were seeing all around them, and trying to articulate why it's important that these stories make it to the national headlines and not get suppressed. Sorry. And the final one is a work by Robin Mondol titled Man Acting as King. And for those of you who are here, you might remember that we are talking about Robin Mondol and this kind of post-independence sort of disillusionment that many artists manifest in their works, which comes from, not representing a specific historical moment, but through their characters representing the kind of subjectivity that they have, and the kind of historicized subjectivities that they have. In the case of Robin Mondol, for instance, growing up as a close witness to the famine, to also the partition, the Calcutta killings, and so on and forth. And that's the kind of thing that we were also asking students to respond to, which is to say that, what do these eyes tell us? So even if you can't see history in a way that we are used to seeing in a painting, then what do the eyes of this Robin Mondol figure tell us about what Robin Mondol must have been feeling, or what this character that Robin Mondol has painted is supposed to be feeling? This kind of hollowness, this kind of disillusionment with all that is around him, as well as kind of a moral bankruptcy in a sense. So these are the 6 artworks that we shared with students, but contextualized in the form of a challenge, then a poster, and then finally an explainer video. So for the next one, I'll turn off my video, and otherwise you'll see 2 of me on the screen. So I'll just turn off my video, and you can see the second of our challenge videos, which is about the painting of Radha as a queen. So please excuse the DIY shooting and all of that. It was basically done at home and edited at home and so on. So, but yeah, so I'll just
In the
turn off
peak
my
of the
video.
pandemic, where you didn't have an option to go anywhere and shoot it
Absolutely, yeah,
either.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'll just need to figure out, I need to turn on this sound, right? Yeah, share sound is turned on. So please let me know if you can't hear this for some reason. Thanks. Hello again. Did you enjoy going through the first episode of Time Traveling Through Art? We are back with chapter 2, where we journey back almost 200 years to look at this painting of Radha, Krishna's beloved. She sits on this majestic throne, surrounded by her friends, wearing a beautiful crown. But how do we know that Radha dressed in this manner? There were no cameras back then, and no one really knows what she even looked like. Why does the painter make her look like the Mughal queen Nur Jahan? And why is she placed in the middle of this forest? What we would like you to do for this art challenge is to try and draw yourself and 2 favorite people. They could be friends, family members, or Bollywood actors, but you have to paint them in a different style, like in the Egyptian style or a Mughal style, or in the manner of the ancient cave paintings of Ajanta, or in a European style. Please take photos of your work and send them to us, and we would love to see what you can come up with. Thank you. Okay, so that was the second of our videos that we made, which was, I mean, apart from encouraging um, students to try and draw someone, we were also trying to hint at these kinds of, I mean, it's I don't know, I mean, it doesn't, it's again not easy to translate, but we were hoping to um, get this point across of of how we visualize the Hindu mythologies, and what are the kind of mixtures artistically that keep happening, and question this whole idea that this is how it was, and that was part of what we were trying to do. And following up this video, we would send out one of these posters, which kind of, because it's often difficult for um, students, school students age. We were targeting roughly, I think, an age group of 9 to 12 or 14 um, through these video modules, through these WhatsApp modules. And it's sometimes difficult for students to kind of, process, go back to the video, watch it, and understand what was going on. So we felt that these kinds of little sort of support would be helpful for them. And also it would kind of enable them to look at, take their time, like look at the images and think through them. So we'll come back to the responses in a bit, but for now we'll just go to the next sort of yeah. So Rajashmita is asking if we've seen responses where they try to mix a couple of these distinctive styles. No, really, we didn't really ask them to mix the distinctive styles so much as try and paint people they know in them. That too would have been a really fun exercise to try out. But we just felt maybe it would be a little complex at this point. So we went with a straight up draw someone in one of these styles sort of a challenge.
Trying to do with our initial challenges was also just to break this, the fear of drawing. I think one problem that people have when we engage with art and try to create different kinds of learning through art is, oh, I can't draw or whatever. So, so you'll see in subsequent challenges also how we try to do that, but sort of make it a little more relatable and get them to look and observe that if they looked at a painting later, they'd at least look at the costume and think about what style is it, or, how do I interpret a painting? So much of that interpreting that painting and interpreting the exchange of cultures that happen, which is so beautifully shown in that painting, is, based on your ability to be able to recognize that, oh, this is a Mughal costume, or, so we were just trying to get people, again, these first few challenges were a lot about just seeing the artwork or just being slowly confident with interpreting different elements of it, the costume, the colors, etc. So, and then connecting it back to that moment in history through that. But yeah.
Thank you.
So for the next video, we'll go to the explainer video. This is about, I think, 3 or 4 minutes long. So just bear with the recorded version of me while I turn my video off. And after we have gone over this, we'll come back to. So we'll just look at a couple of these examples. So we'll look at 2 of 6 chapters, and then we'll try out some exercises. And while we do that, we'll try and reflect on what worked and what didn't work also at times. Hi, so did you have fun trying to draw people you know in different styles? I tried to draw myself and 2 of my friends in this Egyptian style. See if you like it. As you learnt last time, when the British came to India, the Mughal emperors ruled over most of the country. The British and the Mughals each had their own style of painting. Mughal paintings, or miniatures, were filled with beautiful details and rich ornaments. But they often looked a little flat, as if the objects and people were placed above one another. The British and other Europeans painted people and places in the naturalistic style. Can you guess what this word means? Naturalistic comes from something that looks like nature. So what we see in front of our eyes is what they would try to paint. They used colors and shading that were realistic and created a sense of perspective. Perspective is when you paint things that are far from you as smaller and objects that are close to you as larger. It creates a sense of distance, inside the painting that is actually only a flat surface. Indians and British were on 2 opposing sides at this time. British rule was opposed, but sometimes artists made friends with one another. Even if they were from different places, these people all loved art, and so they taught each other their own special styles. As a result of these exchanges, a new style of art was born, unique to India. In Bengal, many Hindu Bengalis who were big zamindars and businessmen wanted to buy paintings. So they demanded scenes from Hindu mythology like Krishna's childhood or stories from the Mahabharata. So what did the painters do? They painted the backgrounds in the naturalistic style, like the British and Europeans used to do, and the characters were sometimes painted in the Mughal style. And let's take a look at another painting now. This is a scene of Krishna and his brother Balaram leaving Mathura. Their friends are sad to see them go. One of them has even thrown herself at the feet of the chariot to stop them. But do you notice how the painter here has not tried to create a sense of perspective or distance like we spoke about inside the painting? The European style is absent here, but notice the building at the back. The palace is painted like a European mansion, right? But why would Krishna and Balaram stay in a European mansion? The other figures in the painting are not painted in the Mughal style but more in the Rajput style, which comes from Western India. The painters painted Hindu figures using European or Mughal symbols of royalty and power, such as crowns or palaces, because common people thought of them as powerful. So gods and goddesses of Hindu mythology, such as Krishna and Radha, are painted in this way to tell people that they are important. Even though no one knows what mythological figures actually look like, they are painted in the styles that make people think of power and glory. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Time Traveling Through Art. We will be back with another art challenge soon. Thank you for tuning in. Right, so that was the explainer video for chapter 2. Um, while we were doing these um, video modules, we also realized that there were certain sort of practicalities that we had to take into account. So we were working with a few NGOs and one school, so we kind of had a discussion where we tried to understand what would realistically be the technological situation at home. And the one feedback that we got was that, usually, I mean, in many cases, there's, I mean, one family or maybe two or three members of a family share one uh, Android device or a smartphone and have limited bandwidth. So firstly, one thing that we had to keep in mind was to keep the video resolution small when we are generating the output and some little details like that. But the other thing was that because it's a shared device, children may not be able to respond on the day of the program itself. So initially we had envisioned it as a 2 week module or something like that, but eventually it turned into something that lasted for nearly 1.5 months each. So I mean, we would send out the explainer video, then we'd send out the challenge. There would also be a lot of interaction with the students. So and after that, they would kind of draw their works, and it would take like a good 3 to 4 days before we got at least, I mean, if not all, then majority of the responses from the students in the form of these WhatsApp images. The other, sorry, the other thing that we realized, which was really important, was the role of the teacher or the contact person at the end of the school or the NGO, which was really important because one of the um, groups that we worked with, we had really a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of very good responses. But then again, there was another one where the teachers weren't as involved, and so it really takes someone to kind of break it down for the students as well. So it's not something that kind of runs on its own, which is, I think, true of any program that we even run at our museums. There has to be someone who's kind of mediating and sort of breaking it down for students, you know and do I mean also participating, because that's something which was very useful for us to see their teacher actually trying to draw with the students, sending their responses. Also helps kind of ease out the confidence difficulties that you face. Is it good enough? Is it something that, I mean, if you're not being graded on it and stuff. So one of like for this one in particular, the responses that we got were these. So they were basically, I mean, they did mention who they were trying to draw. We don't, I mean, it's, um, so, I mean, different. Interestingly, most of them, for whatever reason, preferred the Egyptian mode. I think there was one girl who drew herself in the Mughal style, like this one, but yeah, I mean, clearly the European fashion sense or the others didn't quite cut it as much as this kind of this imagination of the Egyptian mode with the snakes and these um, hairdresses and all, I mean, all of that. So these were three of several responses that we got from across the different modules. I mean, from the different organizations we worked with. And yeah,
And the
so
middle one was by the teacher, right? So I think that's also what
yeah, yeah,
prompted them to do Egyptian
true,
because
true,
their
true.
teacher did such a
Could
good
be,
version of the Egyptian character.
yeah, possibly. In fact, I think this is painting himself or a friend or something like that. Yeah. So we'll move on to the next one, because right after that, what we'll do is we'll come back and we'll try and work with a couple of these paintings and try to see if we, like the group that has assembled today, if we can come up with different activities based on them, because um, we, I mean, it's almost inevitable that we have different takeaways when we look at this work, or even when we understand this historical context and try to create something. So we'll take you through that as well. But for the moment, let's just watch one more chapter with the two videos and that one poster. So yeah. Hello everyone, we're back with another episode of Time Traveling Through Art. You remember that in the last episode we learnt about the different styles of painting, such as the Mughal miniature or the European style. Since India was under British rule, the kind of art that was taught at government schools and colleges was of the European style. Do you remember some of the features that we discussed, such as perspective or naturalism? What I want you to do is to look at this painting by Omanindranath of the old Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan. In the painting, we see him sitting with his daughter Jahanara, looking backwards towards the Taj Mahal, which he had built for his wife. Now, in the painting, this is of course a very sad scene because Shah Jahan is on his deathbed, he is unwell, and he is thinking about his wife. But do you see the color of the sky that Omanindranath paints? What he does is, by mixing this kind of black and blue, he creates a sense of sadness that the emperor feels. So through these colors, he tries to show us the emotions or the feelings that are there in the painting. For this art challenge, what I want you to do is first pick up a piece of small paper. So it can be a card, it can be a page from one of your notebooks. Now think of a feeling that you feel very strongly. It can be happy, it can be sad, it can be surprise, it can be missing someone. And think of the color that comes to your mind when you have this particular feeling. So if you're feeling very happy, you could be thinking of a bright yellow. Now what I want you to do is to take two colors and mix them to create a third color that you think of when you have this feeling. Now paint this piece of paper with this color and try and let us try to guess what feeling you are talking about. Right. So the idea was basically drawing on what we saw in the painting by Omanindranath, which was basically that whole idea of this using this wash technique. And so following up, we sent them the image and this poster, which would kind of break it down for them. So some examples of artists who have used colors to express themselves, and we got a bunch of really wonderful responses. And the idea was, that we wouldn't ask students to tell us what they are feeling, but get their peers and us as facilitators to kind of try and guess what they are thinking, and they would then respond to it saying that, okay, so in fact, this is what I was feeling. So I'll just move quickly on to the next explainer video before we try out some of these. Try designing some of these, not try out some of these activities, but before we try to design some of these activities based on the same bunch of paintings. Hi everyone. Sometimes in school or in other classes, we are taught things, but we cannot understand how we can use it in our lives. Have you ever felt this way? You must have heard of the famous writer Rabindranath Tagore. His nephew, Omanindranath Tagore, had the same experience when he was learning art. He did not feel inspired by the lessons young artists like him were given in art college to paint in their own way. India was under British rule at the time, and so in art colleges and schools, the European style of painting was taught. Students were made to use oil paints instead of watercolors or vegetable dyes, and were taught to paint in the naturalistic style. But Omanindranath did not want to paint like Europeans. He wanted to paint like Indians. But what does Indian art look like? So he started looking at pictures drawn by Mughal painters and by ancient Indian artists. Omanindranath really enjoyed looking at paintings by the Mughal miniature painters. Miniature artists painted small pictures that could fit inside books but were filled with gorgeous tiny details. Omanindranath painted the people and the buildings like Mughal artists, but he used a beautiful mix of blue and black to paint the sky. It really makes us think of how sad Shah Jahan must have felt as he looked at the tomb of his wife. At the time, he himself was sick and did not have long to live. By studying Mughal paintings, Omanindranath was able to invent a style that was completely new. Adding more feeling and emotion to the beauty of Mughal painting, he created a new style of Indian art. Just like you, Omanindranath has mixed shades of blue, black, and white to show this feeling through color. But why do you think Omanindranath did not like European style paintings and wanted an Indian style? At the time, India was under British rule. They were unfair to Indians in many ways. India had always been a rich and wealthy country. Much of its treasures were taken away by the British. Farmers who grew food crops were often hungry because they had no money to buy their food with. Weavers and tailors who made clothes had to sell them at very cheap prices. The British forced Indians to buy things we use every day, like clothes and soaps and biscuits and cosmetics at very high prices. You must have heard of the word boycott. Sometimes in school, children boycott each other for being naughty. But it's not nice to boycott a friend. But the Indians planned to boycott the British around the year 1905. This was known as the Swadeshi movement. Swa meaning your own and Desh meaning country. But how did painters and artists and writers become part of this Swadeshi movement? How did they make a difference? At the time, children in schools read only English stories about English boys and girls going on English adventures. Indian writers and painters started telling stories about Indians. They wrote stories, they painted stories, and some, like Omanindranath Tagore, even tried to find Indian ways of painting. So, would you say that the history of the time and the Swadeshi movement changed the way in which Indians painted after Omanindranath Tagore showed them the way? We would love to know what you think, and if you think there is one particular way of Indian painting that you can think of. Thank you, and be ready for the next art challenge. Right. So these were some of the responses that we got, um, where you know people were and students were just sharing, mixing these beautiful colors. And part of the reason, like Shumana we were discussing this earlier, I mean, we were thinking through why we wanted a different like variety of challenges. So it wouldn't, so I mean, part of this was because we felt that, you know, some students might not be comfortable with drawing, might not be comfortable with human figures and so on. So I mean, coloring is something which is relatively uh, less in a sense. I mean, it doesn't require you to be able to make something look like something. You can just use your imagination and feeling and try to come up with this, and which was a really wonderful experience because it's, I mean, different colors mean different things to different people, and we felt that it was an interesting sort of way to kind of enter into this whole idea um, of mixing styles, of using different kinds of colors, which would emote differently than Western realist modes of painting. So, if so, in the next sort of stage, what we'll try and do is we'll look at the artwork that was part of our fourth chapter that spoke of the nationalist movement in the 1930s. So this was Nandalal Bosu's painting poster titled "Standing Figure Under a Kodam Tree," and what we'll try and do with you today is to, if I mean, we're hoping to make it a little participatory from this point on, and we just like to kind of invite you to try and think of how you might use this work uh, to build an engagement around it for students. So at this point, I'll just pause for a minute. If there are questions, if anyone has any observations, thoughts on this module specific to that, please go ahead and um, ask us. I mean, you can turn on your mic and um, speak up as well, or you can type it in the chat.
Yeah, we really love your feedback as well, because this is an experiment that we were trying on WhatsApp, and we were trying to do two things. There were two levels of experiment. One is, of course, using the medium and using the platform, and trying to figure out what we can do within its limitations. And the second one, which is a connecting thread through our WhatsApp module and the virtual room that we showed in the last two sessions, is this idea of using art to shed new light on familiar historical moments. So in both ways, it was an experiment for us. So we'd love to hear what you think of it and your feedback, your thoughts, questions on how this was delivered, etc. You can perhaps leave it in the chat, or you can put your videos on, whichever. Susan, you're muted.
Okay, yeah. So while we wait for that, should we move on to the next? I mean, people can, I mean, just feel free to ask these questions or share your feedback anytime during this. So um, just like to kind of move into the next segment because we'd also like to, you know, have some time for you to develop this kind of an engagement, which can be, I mean, let's see how much time we have at the end of this session. If not, we can also take it up in the next one. So it can be something that continues, spills over into the next session. Although, just to give you a brief sort of kind of glimpse into what we are planning for the next one, we'll just share the two sort of other programs that we did at Ghare Baire and tell you a little bit about that and explain. I mean, it's. I mean, Shumana, would you like to sort of talk about those two
Let's do
programs?
this first before going into
Okay,
the
cool,
second
cool.
thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, it will be
sure.
confusing for everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, this is the. I mean, it's not a step-by-step guide that we had going into this, but as we were making this, we realized that these are essentially the steps that we like to follow. So, first of all, is to kind of ask ourselves, you know, what aspects of the artwork speak to you. So, as a teacher, as an educator, as an artist, whoever, I mean, whichever role you see yourself as, it's important to kind of identify what aspect of it personally appeals to us I mean, for instance, for me, it's usually the historical context and trying to read that into a painting that appeals to me first. There are many others to whom, say, the emotive aspects of it or the technique of a particular painting, that's what jumps out um, at the very beginning. So you can try and understand what aspects of the artwork speak to you. So in the chat, we just love it if everyone, I mean, whoever wants to participate, we'd love a large participation, obviously. So whoever wants to kind of, think about this particular artwork and just write down, say, just one point about what aspect of this appeals to you most.
Also remember from the previous session, in case you also want some context, Shushan, let's go back to the artwork while people
Sure,
are
yeah,
responding to it, so you can look at it when you're responding. Right. So if you remember again from the viewing room, and like Shujan also mentioned, this was a painting by Nandalal Bose created after Gandhi invited him to decorate the pavilion at the Congress session, the Haripura Congress session. That was a pretty important one um, because that was a session where World War II had broken out. So there was a lot of discussion about how much the Congress should now step back and support the British, or should they continue to antagonize the British. So it was quite an important session of the Haripura Congress. But Nandalal landed up with his team of students from Santiniketan, and they roamed the villages around Haripura and tried to capture what Gandhi had asked him to do, which is the lives of everyday people of India. And this was a series of 88 posters. So this is just one of 88, where he captured farmers, magicians, dancers, potters, tailors, and everybody, every kind of milieu that we can imagine. But yes, this one painting is there in our gallery, and that's what we kind of used as a way and an entry point to this particular moment in our country's history. So, but of course, other than the historical context, like Shujan said, there's just the image itself can have many different registers. So we love it if you could just mention in one or two lines what is it about this artwork that appeals to you. Another interesting fact, I guess, is the fact that everything is made of natural materials, with the whole idea of self-sustaining villages and self-sustaining rural economies that Gandhi was pioneering. But yeah, anything that appeals to you. It's history. It's right. Swastika. Swastik is mentioning the earthiness because of the colors and the person's posture, confident yet casual. Yeah. We have a question about, could you speak about influence of Orientalism over Omanindranath? How did it leave an impact on choosing themes and the way of depicting it? What about their opinion about nudity and sensuality? What was the accepted standard of depicting a character?
So I think that's a question we can maybe take at the end, if that's okay, because basically in this session we didn't really want to repeat uh, material that's similar to what we did for the last couple of sessions, which was more a kind of walk through with the artworks. So let's we'll definitely try and circle back to that, but for the moment let's just try and think of these of the exercise is and of what we could come up with in terms of like learnings and takeaways and how we can possibly design this for students. If that's okay, we'll definitely try and come back to this by the end of it. Thanks for that question.
The way the Kodam tree has been used, indigenous tree. Thank you for sharing, your entry points or whatever you find interesting. Juxtaposing different kinds of representations of rural India, absolutely. Perfect. So, okay, so now that we get to we've sort of looked at this first point, or the starting point of trying to use an artwork to, develop a kind of learning module around it. What personally appeals, all the lines and the work, the different parts of the tree, the figure, the hair. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that appeals to me also, this kind of, very free flowing sort of, uh, it's controlled, but at the same time, there's this sort of, um, it's difficult to put it, like
Recklessness to
informality,
the
reckless.
lines.
Yeah, yeah. This fluidity, the framing and the pose. Absolutely. Yeah.
The
Um,
framing is, of course, very interesting. Sorry, Shujan, you were saying.
absolutely. No, no, please. Yeah. I think
I
we
was just
were.
saying that the framing is, of course, very interesting because he used this framing in every single poster. And again, it was a nod to or a recognition of the communal violence that was flaring up in different parts of the country, and to also, integrate like Mughal culture in the larger imagination of India. The skin color. Like,
Mhm. Did the painter have early Indian Yakshi Alasakanya in mind while drawing the pose and Ajanta murals while painting the contour of the body of the female figure? Well, Nandalal, I mean, it's highly probable that he was, I mean, throughout his life, he kind of carried that influence of Ajanta. Um, but I'm not very sure. I'm not, I mean, personally, I don't have a very strong opinion about the influence of Ajanta in this series because, like we were discussing, I mean, this is a series of 88 works. So they are all, I mean, stylistically, they are very similar in the sense that they all have this kind of natural, earthy color with these very fluid, almost like seemingly careless, reckless lines, and which conveys the sense of motion, and these are not in a sense static people. These are I mean, this is a dancer. This is not just this person in this, I mean, thing. They are performers. They are people who are doing their, I mean, caught in that everyday moment. So it's, I mean, it varies from one painting to another, but um, I'm sure that like some of these influences would be playing on his mind for sure. So that's again another way to kind of read a painting, which is to look at a painting from the lens of or through the lens of inspirations and influences. So what are the different things that are playing on the artist's mind as they're painting this? The movement and stillness with color contrast quite striking. Absolutely, that's, yeah, definitely, that's a big part of all of these works. And if you look, I mean, if you have time, you can look it up online. There's an absolutely, I mean, many of these are available for viewing. So it's an absolutely remarkable sort of series of works that he did. What personally appeals on? Yeah, so we've more or less covered the responses that we've got. Um, Rajoshmita's, I don't know, did we go over that? I was editing the PPT. Yeah. So, so the next um, point that we would like you to kind of, that we also thought about and that we like to try to think through is what could be the learning objective based on this work. So, if you're trying to say talk to a student about this, or not just to a student, I mean to anyone about this, for instance, what would you try to kind of highlight as the major takeaway? So would you be using this to I mean, would it be a historical one? Would it be something that's, I mean, talking about the political moment? Would it be something that talks about um, as Shumona was saying, this kind of use of Mughal frame to kind of paint these scenes of everyday life from rural India? So, what would be the Swastik? Thanks so much. We hope you can join us tomorrow, and if we have subsequent sessions for those as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and for the rest. Um, so again, in the chat, like you shared your what aspects of it speak to you. It would be great if you can think of a learning objective based on this work and type it out, or unmute yourself and share that with us as well. Thanks.
just to say that when we were trying to come up with our WhatsApp modules, we kind of broke it up into a couple of types of learning objectives. So one was this interpretive or looking at art objective for each artwork, like engaging with the art itself. And the second one was a learning objective that pertained to a question around that historical moment. So not so much And the third was actually a fact or some facts or information that we wanted them to learn. So there was a learning objective at the level of just basic information: what is Swadeshi, what is what was the kind of political movement at that point of time. The second one, a little bit more complex than that, was like, what is the question we want them to leave with? And then the third one was, what is the kind of engagement with the art that we want them to have, or questions around the art that we want them to have. So those were how we tried to think about each module when we were designing them. But for the purpose of this activity, you can list perhaps one main learning objective that you would like or to focus on for the activity. What would be like the key takeaway you want students to know? Students, for example, shared an example. So it can also be, if it's difficult to phrase an objective, you can phrase it like a question, like Shujan has. What's the one question you want to leave students with, or you want to raise with students or people who are looking at the artwork?
It's absolutely fine if it's roughly if it's taking off on what personally appeals to us as well, because Indian identity depicted in the art, that's very interesting. Yeah.
That was actually what we did for our
Yeah.
activity, but yeah. Any others? Any other questions or objectives? Think of one, because that will be important to. Uh, who is
That's
this
very
woman and
interesting.
what is her story? Wonderful.
Rural life and tribal movements. So, by movements, are you implying, say, things like political movements, or more in terms of, um, and Rajashmita is saying the use of Mughal elements at a critical juncture of nationalism, therefore, to question the normative ideas of what we define as Indian. Absolutely, yeah. So, rural life and political movements. That's also a very interesting point, because, in a sense, it kind of cuts against the grain to a certain extent of this nationalist celebration of rural India, where it's um, sometimes in the broader narrative, the importance of these movements kind of get left out. So it doesn't really. I mean, that's a very interesting sort of reading against the grain as well. Apart from, yeah, so Mughal elements at this critical juncture of nationalism. Absolutely. I mean, uh, it's also very interesting because this kind of, I mean, I haven't really thought about this at length, but there is also this kind of contestation over Mughal symbols in a certain sense, because in 1903, or I mean the Delhi Darbars that the English used to host, 1897, then 1903, then again in 1911, which was the grandest of them all. So there the British were using Mughal symbols, so they were using that kind of architecture to mark their um, I mean that they are the new Mughals, so to speak, in that sort of a sense. So I mean, one wonders if there is also a kind of contestation where Indian nationalists could potentially lay claim to that as well as a counter argument to this British appropriation.
Continued use of the red fort as well for our
Absolutely,
displays of
absolutely,
nationalism.
yeah. Mm. Okay, great. So we have for students of fine arts, it might be, Ronita is saying, it might be interesting to look at the Haripura posters and say the illustrations and the constituencies, they both involve the same artist alongside each other as a study in how one's political ideas can be conveyed through art. That's really insightful, and you're absolutely right. Of course, this is the same Nandalal Bose who illustrates the Indian Constitution and the values that I mean, I haven't really. I mean, I've of course seen the illustrations, but I haven't really thought of them in the same in this sense, which is to say, what they if and what they communicate of Nandalal's ideas, or of the ideas of the kind of founding principles of the nation. But yeah, it's a very interesting point to consider when we are looking at these works. Abir, in the meantime, seems to have abandoned his class and gone to
Concluded.
thanks,
So how are
thanks.
we doing? How is it going? Yeah.
We're
It's going
now,
pretty well.
yeah,
Yeah,
in the middle of trying to develop an activity around Nandalal's Haripura poster. So
Okay. 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 Please carry on. I'm happy to listen in, and then
sure, sure, sure. So yeah, so shall we move on to the next question then, and which is actually, I mean, which is where it gets a little interesting, because right now we are at the level of thinking through and what are the ideas that we have, which is of course, I mean, extremely important if we want to kind of um, come up with a good sort of learning based on this. The third one is, how would you translate that learning objective into an activity? So in a sense, because at the end of the day, I mean, I mean, what we can communicate is really limiting, or it can also, I mean, it's limiting, but you have to kind of work with that to think of an interesting way to you know make that work somehow. So let's say we want to, like, we can pick any one of these. So it can be um, this question of who is this woman and what is her story. So that, I guess, is a fairly, I mean, it's not something that's very difficult to communicate, which is good, because I mean, pretty much anyone you ask will understand when you show them a picture and you say, well, who is this woman and what is her story? And that could, I mean, bring in question. I mean, that could be at a personal level where you just engage with a woman who's under this kodam tree, dancing happily, carefree. Or it could also bring in this whole question of identity into what is her story. So that's a slightly more complex level, but um, yeah. So just, I mean, whatever you are thinking through, let's just try and encapsulate that. So let's take about 5 minutes or so. We can, it's 6:10 right now, so at 6:15 let's come back, and or I mean, if you can think of them before, then just we can do it on the fly as well. So yeah, let's just try and think of some activities that you can think of based on this and share that with us.
any of the objectives that have been listed out in the brainstorming before on the chat, and try and think about a simple activity that you can do to quickly get students to engage with the question or engage with the idea. With WhatsApp, again, we have a limitation of short attention spans. It all had to be captured within 2 or 3 simple instructions, and it had to be for an age group which also was a younger age group, but also an age group that is not native in English speakers but are trying to have their education in English. So those were some of our limitations, but yeah. So an activity that can get to the heart of the objective, that or the question that has
Mhm.
been, that you're choosing to address. It doesn't have to be a very evolved idea.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
can just be the beginning of an idea. And it can also be like 5 terrible ideas, because out of that, one of them will be great.
Smita saying, create a painting that would best depict an Indian identity in present day India. Yeah, that's a very good start, because I mean that's pretty much what we were also thinking of doing. Like if we want to do a kind of, we the people of India, or so, how would you depict that? What would be like, what kind of activities would you show them performing? um, and that sort of, these sorts of questions, absolutely, that definitely translates um, well into this kind of an activity where you ask someone to paint Indian identity. So I think we had a fairly diverse range of responses, and some of which were about which were taking a fairly kind of socio-economically conscious position. So it wasn't just that students were painting individuals, but they were, some of them were painting situations, um, which would talk of inequality and injustice and so on, which was also wonderful to see. So I mean, the people as embodiments of things that are uh, going on. So that again was an idea that came through, which we hadn't quite anticipated when we set out this sort of an activity. Anyone else who wants to have a go at this? It's very interesting again. Yeah. So Srija is saying maybe create different versions of the figure from different times and spaces. So Srija, what would you say is the essence of the figure that needs to stay constant for it to be recognizable as coming from different times and spaces? So what is the one thing, or what are the things about this that you would ask students to keep as constant? And not that it has to be mentioned, but because it's a question that's open to interpretation, I'm wondering whether we would like to specify that, or whether we would like people to also interpret that essential element as, I mean, in their own ways. The expression, okay. So again, the physical form as expression, I'm guessing, because that's also an interesting uh, kind of way in which we do express ourselves. So that's very interesting. So yeah.
Emotion of the character, no, like the general sense of the
Mhm.
spirit of the character, and keep
Yeah,
that same across line. Very interesting.
absolutely.
That will really also help unpack like this, the idea of this kind of liberated woman. What is it? How has it evolved over time?
Yeah,
That also might be a nice entry point for that kind of a
yeah.
discussion.
And also I think it, one, like what we try to always keep in mind when we are, when we design, or what we tried to keep in mind when we designed these rather, is that the activity that we are giving them reflects what we want that key learning to be. So I think if your learning is who is this woman and what is her story, it's interesting to ask them to do this in different sort of different times and spaces, because then the story can remain the same, but the details of the context can change, so that it could work in that way as well. But if you think of this activity first, then what would say be the learning that you think of through this? Because yeah, I mean, the reason why we wanted to kind of, identify these learnings before, as we were going through the series, is that uh, the activity that first comes to mind when you look at an artwork is something that's dictated by that artwork, right? But if you're trying to build a narrative through multiple images, then it's good to have that in mind first, so that the images themselves connect and create a coherent story of some sort, or a narrative of some sort. So which is why we try to think of that objective first, and then sort of think of an activity, rather than thinking of an interesting activity and then building up um, what our takeaway from that is.
Lovely.
Mhm. Very interesting. Yeah.
Using the frame as a
Yeah.
framing device specifically.
That's lovely, because what was your the use of Mughal elements as a critical juncture of nationalism, therefore to question the normative ideas of what we define as Indian. That's very interesting. So it definitely kind of feeds back into the learning that you wanted to communicate, or you wanted to take away from this. Lovely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can't really think of any other interesting sort of frame. I mean, this would definitely not work with, say, something like a Gothic shape or something. I mean, even an arch seems too boring. I mean, once you've seen this kind of two-step Mughal frame, uh, all other frames pale in comparison to this. It's just so fits so well with this kind of figure. It'd be also very interesting to do this like an Insta frame. Use this as an Insta frame for things that we are posting. Um, okay, so yeah, I think we have found two or three very interesting activities from this. If you come up with any more, please just keep posting them. We'll just move on to the final point, because I mean, time is short. So let's just cover this whole thing, and then we can circle back to it at some point. So apart from the one major takeaway that you hope the activity will kind of inspire, or it will lead to, we also try to think of three takeaways for additional learnings for students after they complete the activity. So this is the stuff that goes into the video that we make. So part of it
Guide
helps
video
us.
that follows the activity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So the guide video that we produce, that should ideally have a little more than just what I mean, explaining what their activity was supposed to tell them. Because I mean, of course, I mean, kids are extremely perceptive, and they figure out what you're trying to tell them, even if they are not articulating it in the way that you necessarily expect. But so the question is, I mean, what three other aspects that could, I mean, of course, right now we have had a series of very interesting responses about what different people's takeaways, primary learning objectives would be out of this. So those could be fitting in, as well as it could also be something that's um, which kind of helps build the larger narrative that you're trying to do through the series. So maybe just if you could list three other takeaways or additional learnings, that would be great. And I think that would essentially bring us to the final step of creating this sort of, I mean, one chapter in this module.
These okay, people don't write it, Shujan, but I think just to make the point, maybe at this stage, because
Okay,
we're running
sure.
out of
Yeah,
time,
yeah. Go
we can just sort of say that it's something to then think about. That once we've
Yeah.
designed the activity,
Mhm.
then you want to layer that, in a follow-up discussion with more, more insights or questions and provocations. Like the activity becomes the initial provocation, and then you want to use that as a kind of springboard to think about
Mhm.
a range of other questions. So that's what our guide video became, where we wanted to layer the activity or the question that was raised in the activity with a few more questions, provocations, prompts, and information as well. So that's how we kind of ended up with this idea of having an activity followed by a guide video. So
Absolutely. So I think let's not get into the other sort of artworks, and maybe in the next session, in tomorrow's session, we can um, think of, say, specific artwork that need not be. In fact, that's something that I guess we can ask people to do,
Yeah.
which is to,
So for tomorrow, if you could please, you can use one of the 6 artworks that we used in our prompt, in our learning module, WhatsApp learning module, time traveling through art. But what we were hoping to do tomorrow is 2 things. One, if you could please bring an example of an object from a museum around you that you would like to think about or talk about, or develop an activity and engagement around in your own classrooms or in your own learning environments. Please bring a copy of, an image of that artwork or that object or artifact, so that then we can try a similar exercise with artworks and objects from museums around you. You could also just bring an example um, from another museum, from Google Arts and Culture as well. You can, virtually take us to another museum and show us an object from there. So we'd really like to maybe now bring this back to your own context. And, these, like Rabi said at the beginning of the session, the methodologies are something which can be hopefully, localized and contextualized as well. So if you could please bring one example of an artwork, that would be the first part of the session tomorrow. And then the second part of the session tomorrow would be to sort of show you 2 more examples of how we use the virtual viewing room, as well as this idea of generating activities around artworks as a way of engaging with students through 2 other programs. One was called the Curious Curatorium. It was a collective of 12, no, 9 students from all over the world who came together and created an exhibition with us on Kunst Matrix. So that was a very interesting learning tool where we didn't create a room and present it to them, but we made it together. And the second one was Museum Ambassadors, where we invited students to come to the museum, look at artworks like you just did, and come up with their own activities. So we'd love to share that with you as 2 other sort of offshoots of the time traveling through art program that we've so far shared with you. So
just to share Ronita's final comment, where she says, could maybe give students a range of different samples of works. Say this work, one of the early Doordarshan, Secular India ads, etc. Ask them to jot down what message they are getting from each and how they would change the work if they wanted to alter the message they received.
lovely.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It might require a bit of explaining, I'm sure, like as you think through, you'll, yeah, but
It can
it's a
be
very
broken up
interesting
into three
point.
separate
Exactly.
activities. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So thanks for that. Um, I guess we'll close here today. Just to kind of quickly go back to the question that Shomrita had asked, should we try to kind of respond to that right now, which is about the influence of Orientalism over Obanindranath Tagore, uh, which is, I mean, Orientalism, I'm not very sure how to think of this, to be very honest, because um, Obanindranath was self-consciously trying to move away from this, but at the same time, we all know that, the dominant culture sort of, I mean, works in mysterious ways and influences our unconscious uh, ways of seeing at ourselves as well. And so that is certainly something that could possibly have been working on Obanindranath. And also there is this whole kind of idea of this glorified past, which he definitely tries to look at, but it's also kind of I mean, a kind of it's up to a point, it's a glorification of the past, but it's also, in I think there is very much an imagination of a utopian future in the way that he tries to build this pan-Asian identity. So it's not, I mean, certainly he does use some of these images that are very, I mean, identifiable by Orientalists, and um, that are part of that imagination of ancient India. But there is also in him this tendency to try and envision the future in a certain way, and um, nudity and sensuality. Of course, the Bengal school, I mean, it's there isn't, I mean, it is sensual in a certain sense, but it's more, I would say, spiritual in the way that women are depicted, and this whole kind of idealized sort of depictions of women. But I think I'm rambling a bit right now, so we'll definitely uh, like these are my initial thoughts on this. But I'm sure there is, I mean, of course, there's also the point that Omanindranath, the first time that he kind of shoots into this um, fame and glory is because he is recognized by the Delhi Darbar of 1903 by Lord Curzon. So there's also a very sort of problematic politics at play there of recognition, of legitimization of a certain mode of representing in modern Indian art. So I'll just, yeah, I'll stop here and look forward to the next session where, like Shumana mentioned, it would be really lovely if you could bring objects. It could be a sound clip, it could be a painting, anything that really you think from a museum near you or even from your homes. I mean, why not? And which you could then build an activity around. So I look forward to that. And if Abhi would like to conclude the session, I think.
I think you're on mute.
Yeah, no, I have very little to say, except that I think I'll need to reach out to a lot more of our colleagues in Ladakh. There are a few participants from there. I was just wondering whether we could have a little feedback in terms of, what you felt, because I might imagine that some of the material might seem a little distant to you. We of course want to make it more and more, which is why the exercise was being discussed. But I was just wondering if there is any feedback that Spazindle or Padmale might just want to give us, so that we can make this interaction a little more meaningful or fruitful. So if there are any thoughts, we have a few minutes. Or if you could also request some of your colleagues to join in if you're finding this interesting and useful, because we are slowly trying to sort of cater it much more to a sort of local requirement. But we are starting a slightly more broad format because of that. Because these ideas remain the same, the exact same. I mean, what we are looking at on the text in the presentation remains the same. It's just the examples of the artworks that change and the context. There's a comment saying illustrations of the Indian Constitution. Granita, isn't there a fantastic presentation by Shivada on the history of a peace website exactly on this?
Yes, there is. That's what I had in mind when I made a comment related to the Constitution, which is because of that. I can just link this person to that talk.
Yeah, why don't you share the link with Somita? I think that lecture itself would be a fantastic introduction to the topic, and then we could take the conversation forward.
Yeah.
Because was it 2018 when that lecture happened? I think it was the last live conference.
19. The 19 one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll try and get a sense of what's going on here, and let's look forward to tomorrow's session. I hope to join you again very briefly before and after, and then we can plan next week out accordingly. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So
Okay.
thanks, Siga. Thanks to Achi Association and to everyone who joined us. Signing out for today, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow. Yeah.
Thanks, Ronita. That